Okay. Anyway, when I get ready to grade, what I usually do is shortly after the deadline. First thing is to verify that we're not missing any assignments, and I don't know. We might have one assignment I'm still waiting for. Um, there wasn't normally any reason for it, but sometimes things come up. Then I just look through them and get a sense of, well, let's see. Generally speaking, as a cohort, um, do the students seem to be getting the material we're talking about? Do they seem as a cohort to understand what's going on, right? Then I let them sit, and I'm usually doing this with more than one class at the same time. And then at some point, I'm going to go through and I'm going to read them all through, and I'm going to assign a kind of provisional grade as I go along. Then at the end of that, I go through them again and kind of grade norm them. And what I mean by that is it's not a curve, but sometimes these classes, I like to have them unfold fairly organically. I'm not a slave to the syllabus. You won't see me using notes. There's nothing wrong with professors who use notes. I just don't do that. I kind of like to outline what's going on and then allow the course to go in the direction that students seem to be interested in, while still making sure that the basic information is being covered. And so as a consequence of that, there may be something that normally I would have emphasized, but for some reason, there was another series of questions that you had that took us in a different and more interesting direction. And yet the assignment that I wrote might have been written a month earlier, when I had an idea that, well, I know we're going to emphasize this. Maybe we didn't emphasize it in the same way. So I won't weight that as much in the way that I evaluate your assignments. In other words, if everybody, or a critical mass of students on an exam kind of don't do well on something, the suggestion there is it's not you, it's me. Okay. There's no reason why a critical mass of students, say more than half of students, would not do well on something unless I hadn't taught it properly. And so what I then do is I back up and say, all right, let's devalue that in terms of how we assign a grade to this assignment. Okay. This, by the way, I hope what's clear here is none of this can hurt your grade. This is me saying, I'm trying to be accountable for your grades to the extent that I may be responsible for you not getting as much depth in an area as we might have intended to get. It doesn't mean you're not learning, and it doesn't mean that the class isn't going well. It's just that sometimes the class goes in a certain direction. It seems to be rewarding for most of the students. I'm going to follow that direction. Okay. I'm not interested in pulling you into the center of the road. If we drift a little bit, but we drift as a cohort and we know where we're going, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. Does that make sense? I know it sounds kind of weird, but it's not a dictatorship. It's not a democracy, but it's not a dictatorship. It's sort of like the United States. It's not a democracy, but it's not supposed to be a dictatorship. It's a sort of republic, and you're kind of voting with the questions that you ask me in class, and the way that you frame your responses in the assignments that we have can give me some insight into, what, maybe we ought to go in this direction, or maybe we ought to slow down a little bit, or maybe they're getting bored. Maybe we need to, speed up a little bit and kind of drift past this. I'm really sorry. I just did a really annoying thing, and I left my phone on, and I'm trying to own up to that when I do. I'm waiting for a call from my sister, my dad. He's not like in distress or anything, but dude is 96 and he went in for some tests today. I'm just going to go shut my phone off real quick. I'm very sorry. I'll be right back. All right. I apologize. Sometimes you forget, like you're working at home and you think you're like being professional, and then you realize, no, I'm looking over here. There's a life-size skeleton over there. Well, it's life-size to me. I mean, it's my roommate, right? But you don't need to know that. Anyway, in other words, it reminds me, hey, you're at home, stay sharp, don't get weird. All right. So anyway, I'll look at those assignments. I'll get them all normed and everything. I anticipate if you made a good faith effort on that, it's pretty much a fill in the blanks thing. What I wanted to ask you is, and I really want honest responses, nothing that you say is going to affect your grade. Did you find the assignment useful, or did it just seem like make work? Was there when you found yourself doing it, were you thinking, why is he got us doing this? This is like sixth grade stuff. Or was it like, you know what, this is cool because I'm now thinking more about how people use data to draw conclusions. Either way, what do you think? I'm really interested in your response to the assignment.
I definitely found myself on the latter of like what you were saying. I did find it useful and whatnot.
Okay.
And then just interesting. You're learning new things about, and like I chose countries that I really had no idea about. So now it's just that one extra thing I do know. So it's something, and it's good.
That's the idea of the assignment, is that, you know, this is an introductory class. And so the purpose of this course is for those of you who either, maybe you're not yet a declared major, but you're thinking international studies. What we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do with it, you know, I don't care what anybody else is trying to do, is to say, okay, but here's the stuff we do. Okay, so make sure you're interested in this stuff before you think about international studies as a major. But if you're digging it and you're kind of like, hey, this is useful, and like Kennedy was just saying, yeah, you know, I found myself choosing countries about which I knew nothing or knew very little. That's a good sign, because what it shows is that you're curious. And not only are you curious, an important component of curiosity is conceding comfortably what you don't know. I think that's the hardest thing for students at the college level, is you've got to be much more forthcoming about what you don't know. What a lot of you might not understand, professors have to do the same thing if they're any good. If you stop learning after you leave graduate school, you're a hack, and you know you're in the wrong business. I mean, I'm probably what, 3 times your age. I'm still learning stuff, and I would be pissed off if I wasn't, because I still got that kind of curiosity that Kennedy was talking about, and a couple of others of you have expressed. I want to know, I want to understand better what's going on. And I'm not going to get that by listening to, you know, the talking hairdos on TV or whatever. I'm going to have to go and look at these data myself. And a couple of you mentioned in the chat and elsewhere, it's like, oh yeah, what this did, it helped me understand how to use that site. That's good, because in subsequent research that you do, whether it's in international studies or not, anything involving country data, that World Factbook is one of the most reliable sources that scholars use and that they encourage their students to use. Let me remind you again, a couple of you came in just a little bit late, no problem, but make sure that you sign in using the chat if you haven't already. All right, now, anybody who didn't really enjoy it that much? Didn't really get anything out of it? You're not going to make me mad, you know. Okay, well, I'm going to assume then that either you didn't have strong feelings about it one way or the other, or you found it useful. I'll say that's a safe assumption. All right, well, let's do this then. Let's move ahead. And if you look at, again, I asked this before, how many of you, so that I know, have access to the Moodle site right in front of you right now? You can actually, okay, good, most of you. That's good. If you don't worry about it, but you're going to need to get access to it in order to, you know, to do what we're doing here on your own. On week 2, in addition to the Zoom links that you see there are these links under, you know, words or phrases. You see industrialization, urbanization, secularization, globalization, and paradoxically, deindustrialization. And then for 3 of those, there's a kind of follow-up article framed as some sort of question, okay? That's what we're going to be doing most particularly within the next couple of weeks. But also, these are the areas that people tend to look at when they look at the world and try to make sense of it. And what some people would say is, yeah, these are the ways that we can know who's modern and who's not, or who's developed and who's not. That's not a very useful or accurate way of analyzing things, though, because simply because a society is more or less urbanized than someplace to which you're comparing it, isn't the same thing as saying that somehow there's some moral superiority to urbanizing, or that, you know, you are in any way really necessarily superior. But it does mean you're different, and those differences matter. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is looking at those 5 trends globally. Okay, and these are not trends within the last 5 years or even the last 50. These are trends really within the last couple of 100 years for the most part. Okay, so this is where the species is going on the planet, and that's why these areas are important. And again, you'll notice there's nothing particularly in there about technology. There's nothing particularly in there about war. There's nothing in there about, science or whatever. What I'm trying to suggest is that what we're looking for is the movements and trends of human societies around the world. And it's particularly what we're looking for is evolution or change in the patterns of life that human beings choose to live, okay? And that's what these are about. The first one, industrialization, if you click on that, you'll notice, and some of you might be surprised, it's a Wikipedia page. You might think, well, that's not political science, that's not international studies. No, it's not, but it's a quite good citation. 5 years ago, I never would have used Wikipedia. 5 years ago, Wikipedia wasn't as good. But a lot of people like you, after you graduate, like me now, are looking at these things and going in and editing and correcting them. So there's a lot of oversight, and a lot more experts and scholars are involved in improving a lot of these things. But this history of industrialization, I couldn't find a better source for you that captured the narrative of industrialization, all right? And again, as with everything here, I didn't want you to have to buy a book or, subscribe to something to get articles or something like that. I'm trying to make the class affordable. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, Wikipedia is quite useful, especially in introductory classes, right? I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at this yet, because I know you were doing an assignment, and I said at the time, I'm not expecting you to have done this, but if you can, take a look. But when we're talking about industrialization, what are we talking about? When people use that term, what are they talking about? This is kind of important. It's hard to argue that there's anything more transformative of human existence other than the domestication of agriculture. But what is industrialization? That was an interesting sound. Well, we've lost one of our cohort, presumably forever. Come on, I can't believe you don't know.
Would it be like, in really, really simple terms, like a country's focus on more of like making things to then sell and whatnot, and like that becomes the basis of, I don't know, accruing their wealth?
I would say that what you're describing would be the process of industrialization within a specific country. But what we want to know is, what is that process? You hinted at it, but the reason, remember, why we're looking at it is this isn't a national phenomenon. This is global. This is also, industrialization creates conditions that then determine where social formations are going to go for the foreseeable future. Ricky, I'm sorry, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say also.
I can barely hear you.
Oh, really?
Can you crank up your speaking tube?
Can you hear me?
Barely. I'll turn up at this. I don't want to turn mine up too much because it can feedback. Try again.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Is anybody else having a little bit of trouble hearing her? I don't find her to be that loud. You're unusually quiet compared to your cohort. Go ahead, try again. And that is the coolest spelling of minute I've ever seen.
Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, sure.
I was just gonna say that industrialization, also in very simple terms, can be just kind of like the advancement of technology and like agriculture to better like a culture or an environment.
I'm not sure what you mean by bettering a culture or an environment. Some people would argue that there's a normative or value-based assumption in that industrialization is better than pre-industrialization, okay? Which presupposes better at what?
I think its goal is to improve functionality.
To improve functionality?
Improve how quickly supply is made, improve the speed at which it is able to be made, just streamline it more.
Why would you need to do that?
Say again.
Why would you need to do that?
Because then if you can make the production cheaper and the sale the same, then you make more money. So it's, I mean, kind of capitalism at that rate, but it expands a community for good or for bad. It just
Okay.
helps the community.
A couple of things to think about is that generally speaking, industrialization kind of comes before capitalism. I mean, formal industrialization doesn't, but the drive to do that, to improve technology, far predates the development of what we recognize as the social and economic patterns of capitalism. And I would suggest that no, it doesn't primarily have anything to do with making more money. When I use the term civilization, what's the picture in your head? When somebody says civilization, what's a civilization? Or what does that mean to civilize? Take a guess.
I think of a town
A
with
town,
people.
Emma, a town as compared with what?
Nothing, I guess.
Okay, so in other words, I think I see what you're saying. In other words, it has something to do with social organization. Okay, Ricky, yeah.
Can you hear me this time? I put in headphones.
Yeah, go ahead.
I see it kind of as like a group of people who have a shared set of like morals or societal standards that they follow, and so they're like similar for that reason.
Is the United States civilized?
No.
The United States is not civilized. Who is civilized?
I just want to say I think that word is based on the idea that there's only one way that people can come together as a group.
I don't think, Eliza, that it is. It is sometimes misunderstood that way, but the term technically is not singular. There are a number of, historically, we've seen the emergence of a number of what we call civilizations that in many ways are strikingly different. But what I'm suggesting is they do have commonalities. Wherever what we call civilization has emerged, it's tended to take on certain kinds of social formations, certain kinds of institutional formations and things like that, that have something to do with what Emma was suggesting with the transition from sort of, you know, a disconnected mass of people into something like a community or a town. But what I want you to start thinking about with civilization is strip it of its normative assumptions of good and bad and right and wrong. Think of it this way. Think of it as the extent to which a given social formation of people, a given society, has both the capability and the will to transcend limitations that are imposed by nature. Okay, so that, for example, when we domesticated agriculture, what does it mean to domesticate agriculture? That's something you may have heard in a cultural anthropology class or something like that. To domesticate agriculture, it's one of the single most important things that that human beings have ever done, because it stopped the idea of human beings being just these hunter-gatherer nomads, which is no more. To domesticate agriculture, what it means is we transcended, we found ways of applying technologies as they then existed to transcend the limitations of available food sources as imposed by nature. We didn't have to wait seasonally in the same way that we had before. We didn't have to constantly go pick up and leave and keep moving in search of more food. We could, in fact, settle in one place and produce food there. And we could do it. That's, you know, the notion of domesticating it. We took control of that. And we took it, not completely, but beyond a certain point, we took some control of that and shared that control with nature and decided we're going to settle here. We learned how to farm as opposed to waiting for rivers to flood, deposit silt, and then for sort of magically for things that were edible to pop up then. We came to understand how that worked. That is, we acquired a technology. All right, the understanding of how to apply skill to produce a desired outcome. And we did that so that we could settle and have food right there. And it's not perfect, but it's significantly different from what it was before that, when human beings were small groups, sort of the pre-town kind of human beings that Emma was talking about, where, you know, you don't really settle in any one place. You can't. You have to keep moving because the food keeps moving along with you, okay? That's the domestication of agriculture. Once we did that, we could create settlements. Once we created settlements, what happens to population? When you create a settlement and you find ways to feed it, then what happens?
Population's able to increase.
And it increases exponentially, not arithmetically, exponentially. Okay, so all of a sudden, instead of being like these little groups of, let us say, we're generalizing, maybe 30 to 50 people at any given time, with, you know, very high mortality rates, particularly among infants, with an age being a real problem in terms of mobility, and therefore a lot of hunter-gatherer societies adopted practices of, you know, euthanasia and things like that, or of abandoning older people, and they would, as far as we know, they would accept that because they knew that they were a fatal burden to the continued survival of that group that was just living on the edge of survival all the time. When you settle and you push back some of those limitations on mortality imposed in terms of food sources and health and, you know, things, and the predictability of life, okay, you are less limited by nature than you were before. Nature's still there. Nature is actually, those forces are still being exerted on us. We're just influencing them or deflecting them in some way. Every one of you right now is living in evidence of civilization. Every one of you is indoors. That's an artificial environment that human beings designed and created to transcend the limitations of climate imposed by nature. It doesn't mean we've eliminated them, but behaviorally, we're transcending them right now. We have domesticated electricity to the extent that we don't have to go over to Southern Oregon University and meet in the same classroom. We can sit here like this and we can have these exchanges, okay? That's evidence of what I mean when I say civilization. That is, we're transcending certain limits that otherwise would keep us from doing this, that are natural limitations. My voice isn't very loud, but you know, you all right now can hear me, right? That's transcending a limitation imposed by nature on, you know, the limit of my ability to project the volume of my voice. The language that we're using and the sophistication of that as an applied technology is transcending limitations imposed by nature. How do I get my ideas out of my head and transmit them to you? We develop the language. So you see what I mean? In other words, you don't have to think of this as, well, there's only one way to do this. I mean, how many languages are there on the planet? Every one of those is a technological variation of how to civilize communication, okay? In the sense that I'm using the term, right? Now, industrialization can be looked at in this context, and there are many ways to look at it. This isn't the only one, but it can be looked at as an era or epoch of civilization. That is, as human civilizations, all of us increasingly began to turn in the direction of applying technology to industrialize. So the question is, why do that? It isn't, as Micah suggested, only because we wanted money. Clearly, people were doing that and were driven by, you know, the idea that if I can innovate technologically and I can solve, you know, a problem imposed by nature, there's going to be money in it for me. So Micah's correct when he suggests that the idea of achieving profit is certainly, it's one of the fuels of industrialization, but the primary imperative of industrialization is a widely shared desire to push back the limitations imposed by nature. Now think about what that implies, right? You know, we're talking about people who, for much of as a species, for most of our history by far, we accepted the limitations imposed by nature, and we did remarkably little about it other than die. We had relatively short lifespan. You could die of, you know, a cavity, you know, if it were left untreated. You know, the simplest thing could kill you, and everyone's life every minute was precarious. So the lifespan was short. People were required to spend most of their time in either hunting or gathering. there was relatively little need for language. And when it was used to do things like coordinate a hunt or things like that. There was no literature to speak of in the printed sense, obviously, in the written sense. There was relatively little, probably, oral history. So that meant there was no sense of history. When you're living in just the cycles of nature, you're living seasonally, you don't really think in terms of history. You think in terms of cycles. History, particularly for Westerners, is generally thought of as linear. Well, we used to be here, then we were here, then we industrialized, then you see what I'm saying? In other words, we see it more as a linear narrative, and we start thinking backwards as far back as we can go. Well, that's not what people did, before they industrialized and some of these other trends we're talking about. I mean, it was more likely that the majority of people would just think in terms of, well, winter's coming. It's going to get cold. The White Walkers are going to come and get us, whatever it is. And it's like, it's inevitable. And so that encourages people to think fatalistically. When winter comes, more of us die. When winter comes, more babies die and more mothers die in childbirth because it's winter, because that's what happens. Well, how do we explain that? Well, we might develop a deity or some human embodiment of a natural force that gets angry with us or gets disgusted with us. And we might say, well, if we could appease that force, right, then maybe it would not take our children when they're born in the winter. So what do? Well, we develop rituals and we make promises and we feed that thing with something other than our children's lives or whatever. You see where I'm going? In other words, that's the roots of religion. It's an institutionalized capacity to fend off nature. Okay. Or at least to find ways to accept it so that it doesn't just drive us mad. But beyond a certain point, when you have settled societies, people have more leisure, okay? So that when you industrialize, and we're gonna get to urbanization, which is another component of this, what you're saying is, it's sort of higher order thinking where you're thinking, it's not just enough that we have a granary where we can store some of the grain from every harvest so that if we have a bad harvest, the city won't starve. The Romans knew that and they weren't industrial. Okay, the Chinese knew that and they weren't industrial in the time we're talking about. But if you said, you know what, we could replace human labor with a machine that would allow us to do what 50 human beings do. And those 50 human beings could do something else, or they could rest a little bit, right? If we could do that, wouldn't that be a good thing? Because it would be easier for us to produce at least the same amount of food or whatever the good, or usually it was food, that we have right now. So in other words, you think of mechanizing things, of substituting mechanical energy for human energy. And that's one of the first and most important elements of industrialization. That's why it's important that when people think about labor now, think about jobs now, when we look at what's called mechanization. Well, to the extent that you mechanize, you eliminate the need for manual labor. Well, most people think of that as a good thing. It's like, well, that's good because, if you think about mechanizing a steel mill, for example, I don't know if any of you are descended from people who ever worked in steel mills, all right? But I can tell you that is, back in the 19th century, early industrialization, that was one of the most dangerous places you could ever work, was a steel mill. It was, incredibly dangerous circumstances, completely unhealthy, sweltering heat, open pits, fire, it looks like hell. If you go back and look at, drawings and photographs of early steel mills, all right, you might think, well, yeah, let's mechanize that because the extent that we do means not only can we produce more, but we put fewer human beings' health and safety and lives at risk. That's a good thing. But what happens to the workers who are displaced by industrialization? What happens to them? Because we're still seeing that, right? We're still seeing it now today.
They're
What-
not able to make money. They're not able to. Is that what it is? I don't know.
Well, you tell me. You tell me. I mean, you're living in it right now. It's not stopped.
Well, how I think of it is like if they're being replaced by machines, they're not being able to make money and provide for their family, and they're not making as much.
Well, that can be. Now, what they can do is presumably then they can maybe find a different kind of work, hopefully something that is safer. And we know that that's historically been what's happened with industrialization, right? When we first started mechanizing, you can think of things like the old granaries and things. That, I mean, these go back hundreds of years where you would use water power. That's early industrialization, really, because you're mechanizing labor. If water can do the work of dozens or scores or hundreds of human beings, right, then those human beings can do other things. And you might say, well, then that means they're not going to be able to feed their families. Well, no, they're going to have to find different ways to do it, or Nanako is right, they're not going to be able to feed their families. They're not going to be able to feed themselves. And so there's a constant need when you industrialize, when you mechanize production, there's a constant need to find activities for displaced workers. That's every industrialized society faces that. And it doesn't go away at any point. Again, as I say, the United States, that hasn't gone away. You know, most people, when they think about the loss of, say, industrial employment in the United States, you know, working on motor plant, you know, the Ford motor plant, or, you know, working in factories and stuff like that, working in steel. And those businesses have largely atrophied in the United States relative to where they were, say, when I was a little tiny kid, when we just dominated the world. There just aren't the jobs that there once were. Okay, so then you think, well, what happens to those people? What happened was they had to get different kinds of jobs. We saw this in the 1980s when, in a relatively short space of time, something like a little over 80,000 jobs related to the automobile industry vanished in the space of a couple of years in the United States. Not coincidentally, a proportionate number of those jobs magically sprouted up like mushrooms after rain across the border in Mexico. So what we were doing was outsourcing industrial production. We found that we could get less expensive, skilled labor in Mexico because the wage structure is different in Mexico than it is in the United States, and they weren't unionized, or they weren't as strongly unionized, okay? And so, you know, this gets back to the point that we were talking about earlier, that Micah was talking about with, you know, the profit motive. It becomes more profitable when labor costs can be pushed down, okay? And then the, you know, consequence of that is, hey, that's great. We can continue to do this. We pay less for the labor that works in the industrial infrastructure. That means, theoretically, we have more money to reinvest in the physical plant and in research and development and things like that. That is, for example, what Germany did after the Second World War. They industrialized very rapidly. They exploded as an industrial power as a consequence of the Second World War. War tends to do that. But after that, in order to rebuild a completely shattered society, infrastructure, and economy, right, they mechanized even more heavily. And what they did was an entire generation of Germans. It isn't that nobody got wealthy, but generally speaking, as a generation, there was this ethic in Germany that, you know what, we owe it to future generations that, you know, we're not going to have the big profit taking that, say, the big American companies are doing now. The American companies that weren't hurt by the war. We were destroyed by our own war. So we're going to rebuild this infrastructure, and we're going to do it by taking the profits of our industrial goods and services and feeding those back into the industrial plant and modernizing that plant. They were further able to do that because of things like the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars, you know, pouring out of, you know, banks in the United States and helping these newly emerging post-war economies to rebuild after this devastation of a world war, right? So again, the idea was we have to rebuild the industrial plant that was destroyed by war. Because by then, all of these settled societies had realized we can't go back and live in a pre-industrial world. We're way too far down that road. We cannot do it. Okay. So when you're looking through this, this discussion of industrialization, you'll see that the first so-called industrial revolution that is generally recognized in history is in Western Europe. Okay. Figure out what that was. We can talk about it more when you have questions and have had a chance to read that. But what I wanted you to do is just take a look at it. you'll see different things come out. There's a discussion in there, although it's far too brief, on the creation of the so-called Third World War as a consequence of global industrialization. Take a look at that. Just skim the article and get a sense of, well, what is this industrialization thing? What did it require of us? Well, it required, suddenly there was a renewed interest in science and applied science as technology. There was a renewed interest in metals and what could be done with those, and the refining of metals and the combining of metals into alloys and things like that, because there was always not only a more profitable, but a more efficient way to mechanize production. But also there were incredible demands for skilled labor. Yeah, we're mechanizing, but still disproportionately, we have a lot of human beings who are involved in this. It also created large physical plants crowded with workers, okay? Which meant these workers were working on these assembly lines and they were specialized. I knew guys when I was a kid, right? They wanted, like when I was living in San Jose, and their big dream was to go to work at the Ford plant in Milpitas, California, because all they had to do for 8 hours a day was put the right front fender on a Ford. And for that, they would make more money than a college graduate might have made, 20 years earlier, because of the strength of unions, okay? And the thing about union labor is that it was generally considered to be more skilled, more reliable, but you had to pay for it, okay? So labor costs increase with industrialization because it requires more skill. It's not just a bunch of people who just push heavy objects. You have to have people who know what they're doing. But the problem with the assembly line is when you specialize at that level, people can be distracted, they can be bored, they can feel like machines. This was a problem from the time that we first mechanized the assembly line under Henry Ford. And the early years of assembly line industrialization in America were incredibly dangerous for workers. The rates of absenteeism, the rates of worker injuries, worker fatalities, far from declining the way people believed the assembly line would push them, went up exponentially. In many factories, there were very dangerous places to work. Well, we had to improve that. Well, we wouldn't have done it to the extent that we did if workers had not organized and demanded it with what's called collective bargaining and things like that. So all of these things are created, all these different, behaviors and social formations are demanded as we pursue this process of industrialization. Okay, so take a look at that, and try we'll look in that in a little more depth probably on Wednesday. But I want you to have the chance to. Am I right in assuming that most of you just didn't have the chance to look at that yet? That's totally fair. It's totally fair. But it's and again, just kind of skim it. Now, the second thing that I wanted to talk about today and have you think about is urbanization. Okay. Now, urbanization, there's an article attached there from the World Economic Forum, which is a pretty general think tank. They don't have any obvious political bias that I know of or anything like that. And they're talking, it's called 70 Years of Urban Growth they call an infographic. And if you take a look at that, it goes from just 1950 to 2020. One of the reasons why I chose that is because that's not quite 10 years before I was born. I was born in 1957. I'm that old, right? I was born the same year that Sputnik was launched, okay? And that was the first, kind of permanent orbit satellite. And it was not, and the important thing there, of course, is that it was not launched by, in quotes, the free world, but by the slave state of the Soviet Union, as it was then described. And that started the whole space race. So, take a look at that, but also keep in mind that the urban population has always been increasing from the time, again, that we domesticated agriculture. But in the last, let's say the last century, it's really exploded. It's really exploded, okay? One of the things that's mentioned here, since 1950, the world's urban population has risen almost sixfold, okay? That means, 6 times, 600%, okay? From 751 million to 4.2 billion, okay? That's just between 1950 and 2018. In other words, more or less within my lifetime, we've seen a 6-fold increase in the urban population, not of the United States, but of the world, okay? Right now, today, about 55% of everyone breathing on the planet right now is considered to be living in what is generally described demographically as an urban environment, by about 2050, that could be as high as 70%. Okay. I want you to think about that and think, what does it mean when you urbanize? What does that mean to urbanize? And again, remember that it's sort of like with our discussion of industrialization. We're not looking at this in value terms. We're just looking at it in as objectively as we can. And what does that mean when people move from the country to the city? What does it mean? You know, Emma mentioned earlier with civilization, the creation of a town. That's urbanization. What does it mean for us as human beings, though? Let me ask you a related question. How many of you went out into your garden this morning and picked the food that you ate for breakfast? I didn't think so. Why not? Well, Cassidy's saying, yeah, I did, but she's not going to admit it verbally. There she is.
I mean, I did. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is really slow.
What did you get?
We have a bunch of like berry bushes and plum trees, and we have like a little apple tree and we have like a massive herb garden. So just a bunch of fruit and herbs for breakfast.
Do you live in a city?
No, I live in Ashland.
Okay, well, Ashland's a small town, but it's, you know, like, okay, we'll buy that. But what's interesting is none of your colleagues seem to have done that. When people lived in the country, it was much more common that they would be more directly responsible, not only for the food that they ate and the production of that, but for the clothing they wore, the house that they lived in, things like that. How many of you built your own house? How many of you could build your own house? I mean, I'll go beyond that. This is one that shocked me. How many of you have ever changed a tire? It's interesting that everyone who raised a hand is a woman. Guys, you know, you've lost a tremendous advantage here. It's just in terms of being useful. There are very few things that men can still do that are useful. I thought tire changing was one of them. Apparently it's not. We're almost obsolete, man. We really are. I'm fine on that because I'm old, but you're not. You better get your shit together and start changing tires. I was amazed that in one of the classes I taught, I asked that question, and it was the same thing. It was weird. The only people who raised their hand were two women, as I recall. And there was one guy who actually said, what do you mean change a tire? Why don't you just use the tires that are on it? Okay. In other words, it's the degree to which urban life creates dependencies and interdependencies. You know, now I can't, was that Cassidy who was talking about eating her breakfast with stuff that she had produced? I can't remember. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. In other words, to that extent, you're much less dependent on, you know, Safeway or, you know, whatever your market is or whatever, you know, shopping cart or whatever. And okay, who said that? Patricia's like, my father made me change a tire before I was allowed to drive. You know what? Yeah. You know why? Because 5 blocks down the road, you can blow a tire. It's a good idea to be able to do that. But most of us don't do that because we accept a dependency. Okay. We go to, you know, like I'm within walking distance of a Safeway. I've got issues with some of the policies, some of the labor and hiring policies of Safeway. And I'm ambivalent about that. But you know what? I just can't grow my own food. Also, I can't cook to save anyone's life. Okay. It's not because I'm a guy, because my brother can cook, my dad can cook, but I can't. It's because I'm an idiot. Okay. But also because I don't care, because the food that I eat is real simple and not very interesting. So, you know, there's only a few things that I eat anyway, none of which I can grow. They won't let me here. I don't own this place. And the landlord won't let me create a garden. And if they did, and I went outside, there's gravel and concrete and asphalt. Not real rich soil for growing food, right? That's an urban environment. So the idea of urbanization is we move together into more, you know, densely populated areas. And in the process of doing that, whether we like it or not, some things change in the way we behave as human beings. When you live, I've had this experience as a little kid. Some of you, may live in like really small towns, and Ashland's a bit of an aberration because, because it's got the university here and it's got Oregon Shakespeare Festival and it's right off of I-5. So it has some of the amenities of an urban environment, and in some ways it's a very small town. It is in fact a retirement colony, which is really creepy. So please don't stay here when you graduate. Find a healthy, fun place to live and don't stay here. You won't like it. Unless you have your own food and all that. But the idea is that when you're living in the country, you're accepting that you're going to encounter fewer people just in the course of a day. And also you're going to encounter few, if any, strangers, which means you'll be much more likely to have developed some measure of intimacy with the people around you. So that sounds good. It means you can trust them, and if there's a problem, they'll help you or you'll help them and things like that. Those things can actually transform significantly in urban environments. They can also go away, okay? If you live in a rural environment, okay, you are much more likely to own, especially if you're an American, to own at least one firearm than if you live in the city. In fact, you're much more likely to own multiple firearms than people who live in cities. Why is that? Is it just that people in the country like to shoot things and make big noises?
So personally, for me, I come from a very small farming community in Nevada, and irrigating is, one of the biggest things with farming. And my family, whenever they irrigate overnight for like 3 days. So they have guns on them for self-protection and stuff from like coyotes or like whatever animals are out there. We've had a couple of like mountain lions and stuff. So for me, like that's what I think about, is like they're protecting themselves from nature.
No, that's kind of where I was going with this. In other words, if you're in the city, nature's been pushed out of the way. Whether it should be or not, it has been. One of the weird things about Ashland is that we've had several warnings about big cats, like 200-pound cats, and bears and stuff. I've seen a bear here, and it's like, what kind of place is this? What the hell's a bear doing in my street? It's my street. I pay taxes for that street. Get out of here. And then I'm thinking, yeah, but it's a bear, man. It's jolly. It's a jolly bear. But when you're in the countryside, right? That's where nature lives. That's where nature's more comfortable. And that's where nature is kind of sharing space with you. And even if you don't mean to, if you aggravate, some of the representatives of nature, they're going to light you up. Okay. And so you have to have protection. The other thing is, I've known people who live in the country who have lived there for a long, long time. And one of the things they started noticing is, well, first of all, these people would move in and we'd never seen before. And they'd be real quiet, and there'd be a lot of coming and going. And we noticed that they, like this one I heard, well, they put like foil and stuff over their windows, and we'd never seen that. Yeah, it was a meth lab. Well, it's not a great idea to have a meth lab right in the middle of the city. I mean, yes, there's convenience for delivery at source. I get that. But a lot of times you will see people who will put their entrepreneurial exercises out away from people, because you have fewer police officers, if any. If you're in a rural environment, for example, you're much more likely to rely on, say, the sheriffs or something like that, rather than to have a specific municipal police force. So you're more likely to need protection. The police just aren't going to get there. Or if you call the police, because of the architecture of infrastructure, it might take them 40 minutes to get there. And so you might not have that 40 minutes, or there might be a situation where, some, representative of nature is, creeping on you at night, and you got to protect yourself. You don't normally think of those things when you think of urban environments. Okay. So this notion of urbanization, I want you to, take a look at that and think about this notion of urbanization as a global trend. Okay. Because this is happening everywhere. It's not just happening in the United States, and it's not just happening in the so-called modern world. So then one of the assumptions about that, derived largely from, Western settled so-called liberal democracies, is that as people urbanize, they become more liberal in their politics. It doesn't mean that someone who was a Trump supporter and then, moved from Gold Hill to Portland is magically, going to vote for, Joe Biden or something. That's not what we're talking about. What we mean is that you're more likely to kind of alter, maybe generationally, maybe it's your kids who will be that way, but you're going to alter the way that you view the people around you, the things around you, and you're going to become more tolerant of things you might not have tolerated when you were living in the country, because they become part of your everyday reality. You're more likely to tolerate things with which you have a routine exposure, to which rather you have a routine exposure. In other words, you might tolerate spending money on a bus system or a train system or what's called infrastructure because you really depend on it. Whereas people in the country might think, well, I don't want to pay for that. I don't need that. I don't use it. Why would I pay for that? You're more likely to value higher education because in the city, that's where people with higher education go because that's where the jobs are. And so you're more likely to raise your kids to value education. That's moving in a more small L liberal direction. Again, it doesn't mean that a Republican is going to start voting Democrat. That's not what we're talking about. But it means that of necessity, you're going to have to learn to tolerate people who are different from you. You're going to have to learn to tolerate situations you wouldn't have put up with. You're going to have to put up with crowds. You're going to have to put up with using public transportation or dealing with, infrastructural congestion, commute traffic, things like that. And that compels you to become more tolerant. It does not mean, though, that you move to the left in your politics. Okay? So one of the questions is, does that always happen? So the article that's right next to the general thing on urbanization is this. It's called A Tale of Urban and Rural: How Environmental Factors Affect Our Politics. Now, I did tell you, I think on the first class meeting, even though my training is in political science, this is not a political science class. But politics reveals who we are in terms of public decision making. That's what politics is. Politics is not campaigns. Campaigns are a part of politics. Politics is the way that we go about making legally binding, enforceable public decisions, okay? That's different in the city than it is in the country because the needs of the people are different in the city than they are in the country. The level of tolerance might be different. The level of exposure to different variables is going to be different. Somebody living in a city probably hasn't had to go out and shoot a raccoon lately. Somebody or a skunk, somebody in the country might have had to do so, and so the idea is, does something happen with our politics when we urbanize? And I like this one because it's pretty even-handed. Some of the things will surprise you. This is one that I know really surprises people. It's about living in cities, okay? This is from the Harvard Business Review, which is hardly a left-wing publication, okay? And a number of people from University of Michigan did this study they called The Crowded Life is a Slow Life, okay? Here's one of the things they found. In more densely populated countries, that means around the world, we saw less sexual promiscuity, lower fertility rates, higher preschool enrollment, and a greater societal emphasis on planning for the future versus solving today's problems. You see how those things can all translate to a kind of political liberalism. Liberalism is predicated on the future. Conservatism tends to be predicated on getting through today by relying on the past, okay? You see how neither one of those is right or wrong. They're just different ways of looking at the world, okay? Most people will argue, particularly people in the countryside, well, if you move to the city, it's decadent and permissive and all that. What they're finding is, no, you know what? No, it's not. Not more than it is in the country, all right? And this is a global trend, okay? So I want you to look through this. I think you'll encounter some things that might surprise you about what the data will reveal in terms of the trends that we can see around the world, in terms of distinctions between a growing urbanization of societies and the shrinking level of, rural life that we see. We find fewer and fewer people who are living on family farms. We find fewer and fewer people who are able to live out in the country. When we find what are called red states in the United States, that is states where the population is disproportionately Republican. That's important because Republicans as a party are less than 30% of the electorate. And yet there are states where they just absolutely dominate. Okay, well, that's partly because they're not very densely populated. And to the extent that they are, they tend to be more likely to be populated with people who are like them. That's part of the appeal of living in the country, is that, I don't want to deal with people who are different from me. That doesn't make you a bigot. It just makes you a different kind of person. Some people really like that, usually younger people. So cities tend to be younger. Cities tend to be more diverse. Cities also tend to be networks of interdependencies at a level and a regularization that you tend not to find in the country. And what happens is, as we've urbanized, and this is happening elsewhere in the world, you withdraw resources from the country and deploy them to the city of necessity, okay? And that's because there are just fewer people living in the small towns and rural areas of America. And so the tax base is lower, right? The property values are stagnant or declining because fewer people your age want to live in the country, want to live in a small town, because there aren't very many opportunities for you. So a lot of you, even though you may not be aware of it right now, you're going to end up living in an urban area because that's where the jobs are going to be. And that's where the opportunities are going to be. That's where higher education is more likely to be. It's not going to be out in the middle of nowhere, okay? So what happens is, particularly in the United States, a rural population is significantly older, significantly less well-educated, and significantly more vulnerable to infrastructural crises, like there's no ambulance service, or we don't have the money now to have a police force. I've been dealing with people, I don't anymore, but a few years back, with little small towns like Coquille, and kind of sitting down, just behind the scenes, unpaid, let me see what I can do, and trying to figure out, well, what can we do in terms of a couple of these small communities maybe sharing a municipal police force? Because between them, they might have the money to do that, but individually they don't, okay? Those are the kind of crises that you face in small towns. It isn't because people are mean, and it isn't because people hate small town America or anything else. It's just that you got to spend the resources where the people go to live, and they're just not staying in small towns. So then the challenge is, well, how do we preserve those small towns for the people who don't have the option and can't leave, and make sure that those people have some quality of life while still deploying the resources that we need to keep our cities vibrant and safe and healthy, right? When no one wants to pay taxes. It's a constant struggle. All of this is created by consequences of domesticating agriculture, consequences of industrialization, and the movement over centuries from countryside to the city by human populations all over the world. Okay, so that's what I want you to, that's all I really wanted you to take a look at, for today, and have that kind of, pretty much under your belt by Wednesday. Now, you'll notice that the next couple of things we're going to look at are secularization and globalization, and what do those things mean. What I'm asking you to do again is, at some point, if you don't have it in front of you now, sometime before Wednesday, just go to the Moodle page and click on, you don't have to worry about deindustrialization if you don't get that far, but look at those links on industrialization, urbanization, secularization, and globalization before Wednesday, okay? All right, are there any other questions? I'm sorry, Dylan, do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
What about suburbanization, like the movement of people in the suburbs?
We're going to get to that after we've gotten through everything else, because yeah, I mean, I want to keep it fairly structurally simple to begin with.
Okay.
What that's called, some people call that demographic interstices. In other words, there are demographic settlements between the city and the country, which is where a lot of people live. What we will find, for example, is that increasingly suburbs are now considered in many demographic studies to be part of metropolitan areas, because the linkages between them are so strong that there would be no suburb if not for the city, and that people in the suburbs, they commute into the city to work and things like that. So that functionally, they're a kind of frontier of the city. Then you get into what are called the exurbs. And those are people who are really fleeing everything else. And that might be people who would say, leave Portland and move out to, I don't know that part of Oregon all that well, but like,
Hillsboro, I don't know.
what's that?
Like Hillsboro, I don't know.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to say, was Hillsboro, but for some reason, every time I say that, people get mad. But yeah, Hillsboro is almost like an excerpt of Portland. It's less connected than the places that are right outside of Portland, which are generally, people will say, I live in Portland, even though in terms of the way the lines are drawn on the map, they don't. They're part of Portland's culture. They're part of Portland's infrastructure. They're part of Portland's economy and everything else. Whereas if you're living in a very small town, like say if you don't live in Medford, which is considered a metropolitan area, but you move all the way, you don't just move, say, to Talent, which would be sort of a suburb between Ashland and Medford, but you move out to Gold Hill, or you move out to Shady Cove, all right? And if you try to create that's a rural area. But if you try to develop that rural area to have all the amenities you would have had in a city, that's what people are talking about with exurbs. Okay. But I don't want to get into a lot of demographic confusion, because a lot of people do find that stuff confusing. And also, in fairness, demographers don't always share the same definitions at the same terms. But that complexity is part of what we're looking at in terms of social movements, social migrations, things like that. And one of the kinds of common social migrations we've seen over the last several centuries has been from countryside into the city. Now, if they stop along the way, or they leave the city and go halfway back to what are called suburbs, like Dylan's talking about, that's important for us to take note of. After the Second World War, we saw the explosion of suburbs. There was a developer whose last name was Levitt, and he was developing these really quick kind of shake and bake developments, outside of New York City. All right. And they were called Levitt towns. And they were these very inexpensively produced, like maybe 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom houses, little tiny things, but they gave people a chance to have, a single owner, dwelling, to have sort of that white picket fence American dream and all that. That was a very important development in the United States after the Second World War. That's what Dylan's talking about, I think, with suburbs, and that is important. But the main thing is that notion, often artificial, between the country and the city that we need to look at. Does that make sense? But Dylan, that was a good point. Thank you. Yeah, that I hope clarifies that a little bit. Is there anything else? All right, then I will hopefully see all of you this time Wednesday. All right? All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.